The Saturday edition of Newsnight. I'm Gareth Edwards. The attack in Nairobi this week certainly has not been the first time that Al-Shabaab has pounced on Kenya. Just before the break, I was attempting to speak to Dr. Akinola Olojo. He's a researcher at Transnational Threats and International Security at the Institute for State Security. Dr. Olojo, hello to you again. I believe I have you with me now. I was asking the question, do you think Kenya is winning the war on Al-Shabaab? Good afternoon to you, Doctor.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a very important question. Is Kenya winning the war against Al-Shabaab? I think we first have to look at two sides to this response. And the first is, so far the Kenyan government has invested heavily in terms of trying to put in preventive measures. We noticed that on Tuesday during the attack, the General Service Unit, which is the paramilitary wing of the Kenyan police, was quite quick in terms of their response. And even the other first responders who arrived at the scene of the attack, compared to what happened in 2013, we saw that there was an improvement and that there were lots of lessons learned. On the other hand, I think it's important to note that for Kenya to win the war against violent extremism, it is necessary that there is a comprehensive approach that goes beyond the use of force. Now, what do I mean by this? Military might has its limits. The military, the armies involved in Somalia against Al-Shabaab, they have a role to play, but we need to go beyond the military mindset. There is a need for Kenya to be able to consider other dimensions, such as the criminal justice framework. To what extent is the rule of law really having its way? To what extent is it successful? Are there fair trials of those who were former extremists, who were Kenyans who joined Al-Shabaab? To what extent have the allegations against the Kenyan government of clerics who had been killed back in 2012 to 2014? Amnesty International raised some of these issues, but there's a lot of debate regarding the response of the Kenyan government. There are also other dimensions. There is the ideological aspect of the crisis. To what extent is the government working regionally as well, trying to address the ideological narratives pushed by Al-Shabaab? We know that one of the reasons why Al-Shabaab attacked was to also amplify its propaganda. They chose Kenya and the capital city, Nairobi, also because Kenya is a hub for businesses, for diplomatic activity, for tourism, and it's an attempt to try and draw in new members. So they get the kind of international visibility and media coverage that follows an attack. So how are we addressing the ideological components? And I could go on. There are other aspects. There is also the need to address the socioeconomic deprivation factors, which push people who feel vulnerable and marginalized in the border towns of Kenya and counties. So these are just a few of the things which can make up the comprehensive approach. Doctor, and they need to be treated with a sense of urgency.
Dr. Olojo, those are a lot of issues that Kenya is going to have to deal with, and thank you for those. Give me a sense then of the regional bloc, the regional role players. Can Kenya do this by itself? Does it need outside help? You mentioned the African Union, of course, but what about the regional role players around Kenya? What can they do? Should they do anything?
Absolutely. There is a major role for a regional approach. So when we speak of the comprehensive approach, it entails going beyond a single country. The nature of terrorism today, or the way terror groups operate on the continent and globally, is such that there is a transnational character. And we've noticed this as far back as 1998 when the US embassies were attacked in Nairobi and, of course, in Dar es Salaam. It highlighted the need to have a sort of comprehensive regional approach addressing this transnational character. And it explains why even in the present day period we have the African Union mission in Somalia, which of course has been there for quite a while, involving a contingent of countries like Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and even beyond East Africa. We have Nigeria and Ghana, Sierra Leone, all part of the contingent. So there is a need for a regional approach. And, this is something which, has to also be improved upon in terms of the coordination, the various components that are addressing this various aspects of the crisis.
You mentioned earlier the ideological narratives that the Kenyan government needs to deal with, and this is what we have seen from splinter groups like Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc. over the years. It's all to do with this ideological narrative that they're trying to push. You're suggesting, Doctor, forgive me if I misunderstood you, you're suggesting a better understanding of those ideological narratives and work with it, or try and suppress it? Forgive me if I got your answer incorrect.
Okay, we need to acknowledge that part of the terrorist agenda is not just to cause violence. It's more than just the fatalities. There is the propaganda aspect, like I mentioned earlier, and part of that feeds into the narrative that terror groups use, such as Al-Shabaab. Now, if we can also draw linkages with what happens or what is happening in the Lake Chad Basin countries, such as Nigeria, where you have the Boko Haram crisis. There is an ideological aspect to the crisis. So even when you solve the problem of poverty, for instance, you address socioeconomic deprivation factors, when you address governance factors, all of which are very important, but there is always that ideological aspect to it. If you look at terror groups, for instance, a lot of times they pay attention to historical events. Now, Al-Shabaab chose the 15th of January for a number of reasons. I mean, there is a lot of debate about this, but one of the arguable reasons is that it coincides with what happened 3 years ago when they attacked El Ad, the military base of Kenya in Somalia, and over 150 Kenyan troops were killed. If you look at what is happening with the case of Boko Haram or the Islamic State West Africa province, most of the time when they construct their narrative ideologically, they make reference to history. They talk about things like the Sokoto Caliphate from the 19th century. They talk about things, for instance, like the Kanem-Bornu Empire from the 15th and the 14th century. They talk about things like, they make reference to historical figures like Ibn Taymiyyah from the 13th century.
Yes.
So in the case of Al-Shabaab, there is also that kind of attachment to events, to cycles, to historical, spaces and places. So that being said, an approach that is comprehensive must engage community actors who are most familiar with the kind of narrative that these groups push, such as Islamic clerics. Because, for instance, some of the Islamic clerics that can be engaged in this approach, they understand the kind of tenets and the ideas which groups like Al-Shabaab manipulate to draw members.
Dr.
So these
Olojo,
are the kind of things which we need to be looking at.
It's fascinating discussion and incredible insight. Thank you so much for coming in to speak to us, and I'm sure we're going to speak to you again as Kenya gets to the bottom of what actually happened here and how best to deal with it. Dr. Olojo, it's been a huge pleasure having you with us here on Newsnight, coming out of our Pretoria studios this evening.